So far we've discussed some very basic UV manipulation. You've applied mapping and also moved, rotated, and scaled UV points. There are other tools though in the UV texture editor that allows you to create some more complex results. And one thing you can do is sew or split edges, or merge or split UV points inside UV texture editor. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to create a primitive. I'm going to limit the number of faces though, so it'll be easier to see what's going on. So I'm going to go to Create, Polygon Primitive, Sphere. I'm going to go to the option box this time, and then change axis divisions and height divisions to 4x4. And then create. This will create a very simple sphere, be very faceted looking. It'll be good because it won't have many faces and it'll be easier to see what's going on. So there's the sphere. I'll turn on Smooth Shade All so we can see it better. And then I'll go to the UV Texture Editor. And there's the layout. Now right now, it's provided UVs because it's a primitive and also has a sawtooth pattern at the top, which is one option for making primitive spheres. Now, just like when you have multiple UV shells, edges are split, you have something similar in this case. For example, I pick an edge at the top here, like this edge, the corresponding opposite edge is automatically selected. Why is that? Well, it's one edge on the model itself. There's a single edge here at the top. The reason it's two edges here is to flatten out the model and to give you a sawtooth pattern. So what was one edge is split into two edges in the UV texture space. Same with this one. If I select this edge, the opposite edge over here is selected. So again, one edge on the model is turned into two edges in order to flatten it out and to form that V-shaped sawtooth where there's gaps at the top. The same happens on the side. In order to get this side separate from the other side in the UV texture space, this edge had to be split. So if you look at the model, here's the edge here, one edge. That one edge has to be turned into two edges in the UV texture space in order to flatten out that sphere, as if you're taking a globe and turning it into a map. In that case, that had to be split. So here's the edge here, and the corresponding split edge is over here on the opposite side. So even though there hasn't been any special mapping applied to this, at least by myself, there are split edges. You can actually sew those edges back together, though. What you can do is select an edge, say like this top one right here, the opposite split edge is automatically selected. Once that edge and its opposite corresponding edge are selected, you can go up to Polygons and go straight down to Sew UV Edges. And Sew UV Edges will take what was two edges in UV Texture Editor and return to a single edge. So Sew UV Edges, and the edge is returned to a single edge. Now it doesn't affect the model. That single edge on the model remains a single edge. The two edges are returned to one here. You can sew any pair of edges you want together. For instance, I can go over here, select this edge, corresponding opposite edge is selected, then go back to Polygons, Sew UV Edges. And then once again, select this edge, get the other one automatically selected, back to Sew UV Edges. And now I've returned the UV layout at the top to be similar to the actual model where you have a pinched pull. You have a bunch of triangular faces that descend upon a single point at the very top. That's what you have here. But you can sew any pair of edges together you want. It's up to you, whatever makes sense for the layout you're trying to achieve. And some edges might not make sense. I could try to sew this edge to the opposite edge. Then I'm going to get a twisted model where faces overlap. In fact, let's just try that. Back to Sew UV Edges. And I've sewed the edge together, but now the model is twisted, and I have overlapping faces, and it's a bit of a mess. So I'm going to click on Do, return that. So you don't want to sew all edges back together. Occasionally it does make sense. Occasionally it doesn't make sense, but it's up to you. Now you can also split edges. In fact, what I can do is either split those edges that were sewn back together to return to my original sawtooth, or split edges that are never split in the first place. In fact, that's a great way to make your own custom UV shells. Of course, you can make separate UV shells by applying multiple mappings, multiple UV mappings, or you can simply do it this way. So for example, let's say I want to cut this into two shells. What I could do is split the edges down the center and pull two separate shells apart. Let's just give that a try. Now, in fact, we can do it in one fell swoop. If I click this edge and select this edge and this edge, I'm just pressing the Shift key to select all these edges. What I can do is go to Polygons and go to what's called Split UVs. Now it's going to look like the edges are coming apart, but really it is cutting the UVs apart. What was one UV point will become two. So I'm going to apply split UVs now. Initially it doesn't look very exciting, but what was one edge has become two in each case. So what I can do at this point, now that I've applied that tool, is click off, go to my UV mode, and then just carefully click one time at where a UV point would be, like at the top, and move that aside, and that's going to reveal a split. So I'm not dragging a box to make the selection of the UV point, I'm simply clicking. I'm clicking one time, like right here, click, and that only picks a single UV point, and by picking a single UV point, I can successfully move one side away from the other. Now if you try to drag a box to select the point, you'll get all the points in that area, and then the edges stay together, at least in terms of moving them around. But by clicking a single time, I can pick a single UV from one side of the model and then move the edges apart. So now I've created my own custom UV shells, and one shell over here and one shell over here. Again, all I do is pick all the edges on the center, and while those edges were selected, go to Polygons, Split UVs. Once they were split, then I go back to UV mode and click on UV points to pull those edges apart. I can neaten this up. I want straighter edges. What I can do is continue to move the UV points, or do something like pick all the points along the new edge, go to the scale tool, and scale in one direction, like left to right, until they become flat. So now I've straightened out that edge, and I'll straighten out this edge too. So now I have my own custom UV shells. Now if I got tired of that, or I changed my mind, I could resew this back together. I can go back to edge, pick one edge, the opposite split edge, it's automatically selected. Go to Polygons and go back to Sew UV Edges to return that to a single edge. There's also another way to sew edges, and that's just below that. That's called Move and Sew UV Edges. And that works a little bit different. What happens in that case is one edge is moved towards the other. In fact, the entire shell is moved to match up. Let's just try that. So I have an edge picked, so now I'll go ahead and apply Move and Sew UV Edges. What happens is, indeed, the edge is returned to a single edge, but the attached UV shell, in this case on the left side, is moved completely over. And so that's a way to take a totally different shell, move it over to the first shell you had selected, as opposed to having to move it yourself manually. Now I'm going to click Undo and go back to the split. Now if I don't use the Move option, let's say I just go ahead and pick this edge again, and then go to Sew UV Edges instead, there's not going to be any moving. So Sew UV Edges, what happens is the edge is indeed returned to a single edge, and the two faces on either side of that sewn edge become larger in order to make that a single edge, but the rest of the shells are left intact. In other words, nothing else is moved. So if you apply just Sew UVs, then the new edge or edges are formed, nothing else is moved. If you apply Move and Sew UVs, then the entire shell is moved over towards the first shell. In other words, one shell is moved towards the other. So I'll click Undo, make two shells once again. And that will happen no matter what edge you select. For example, if I dolly out and pick an edge up here at the top, well, here's an edge here, and there's a corresponding split edge up here, which was provided by Maya when the primitive was made. If I go ahead and apply Move and Sew now, I'll get a different result. So Polygons, Move and Sew UV Edges. What it's done is it's taken the shell from the right and flipped it over towards the top in order to get this edge sewn back together. So the Move and Sew really gives priority to edge quality, and it will move and rotate one of the shells in order to maintain the edge quality. Sometimes it can be convenient to just go ahead and move an entire shell over right away. So I'll go back to Undo and return myself to two separate shells. So those are ways to split edges, sew them back together. You can also do that to individual UV points, and there's separate tools for that. For example, let's say I want to return this UV at the very top, so it's sewed back onto this UV, because on the model, these UVs are really a single point up here at the top. So what I can do is sew those UVs back together. So let's say I pick this UV and then shift select this UV point. Then go up to Polygons and go down to Merge UVs. Now I want to check the option box in this case because this kind of works like the merge vertices you might use for polygon modeling. So merge UVs, option box, and there's a threshold. And this is based on UV distance. So they have to be closer together than this threshold in order for those UV points to be merged. But if I go ahead and move the slider all the way to the right, then that's a very large UV distance, and they'll go ahead and merge together. So I'll hit apply at this point, and those UV points are merged down to a single UV point.